Let's first build the part where we can press a little thumbs up button on the employee row to toggle the visibility of the coming benefit selector component. Right now, the employee rows you see on the employees page are rendered using a table in the employee overview component. The body of the table contains a for each statement that iterates over an employee's collection. We'll see where the employees are coming from very soon. Each employee gets a TR and TDs containing the details of the employee. The first one renders an image, the name of which is determined using the employee ID. You can find these in the root folder. The rest of the TDs just render property values from the employee directly. Now we want to introduce new state for each individual employee row. In the next clip, we'll introduce a boolean that will toggle the visibility of the coming benefit selector component. In almost all cases, it makes sense to create a new component for items you render in the for each statement as soon as state is involved. In the components folder, let's add a component called employee row and cut and paste the razor from the for each statement to the new component. And we create a code behind file for it in the form of a partial class. Somehow the new component has to know which employee it has to render, so we add a property of that type. Now the idea here is that the employee property can be set by employee overview. Now what's needed when a property has to have the ability to be set by another component? Yes, the parameter attribute. Now we can adjust the razor to make sure it renders the employee properties. Now in the for each statement, in employee overview, we can render an employee row instance for each employee. We don't need a using statement because I've added the namespace the component is in to the _imports.razor file. The current employee from the for each statement can be passed into each employee row instance like this. Syntax can be used here that is very much like setting an attribute in HTML. But please remember the add sign here. If you omit that, the static string employee will be passed in. When we now run the application, it runs exactly as before. So we now know how to pass values along from parent to child components. But what if a value has to be passed from page to page? Parameter values can also come from routing. To illustrate, I'm adding a new page component, employee detail. Page directives also support expressions like employee ID here, that is between curly braces. That part of the URL can now be mapped to a property with the same name, decorated with the parameter attribute. We're using a code block instead of a code behind file in this case, to keep things as clear as possible. The case conversion from Camel to Pascal is automatic. The value of the property can of course now be rendered anywhere we want in the component. Somewhere else in the application we can now create a link to the page, passing in the employee ID as part of the URL. In the new employee row, for example, with an A tag in this case. Note that this property is of type int, but in the receiving component the value is a string. A value from a route will always come in as a simple string. So if you would like to use it to look up an employee in the data store, for example, you are responsible for converting it back to an int. Passing in complex type directly from page to page is not supported. However, you could use serialization for that. Okay, let's run. We see the link in each row, and when I use it, we can see the minimalistic details page for the employee. We're adding the conditional rendering next.